Hello. The message from Sarah's phone lit up my screen at 3 a.m. Working late again, honey. Don't wait up. I stared at those words, my stomach churning as I lay next to the empty space in our bed where my wife of 8 years should have been. The same wife who, just 3 months ago, had sat across from me at our kitchen table, tears streaming down her face as she explained how monogamy was suffocating her and how an open marriage would make us stronger. I remembered how she'd held my hands, her green eyes wide with sincerity as she promised that everything would be perfectly transparent, that we'd set boundaries, that our marriage would always come first. Like an idiot, I'd believed her. I'd believed her because I loved her, and because after 15 years together, high school sweethearts who'd made it work despite everyone saying we were too young. I thought I knew her better than anyone. But the signs were everywhere now. The late nights at the office had started 2 weeks after our agreement. The mysterious texts, the new lingerie I never saw, the sudden girls' nights out with coworkers I'd never met, the way she'd turn her phone face down whenever I entered the room. Classic signs I'd been too trusting to see. That night, something in me snapped. Maybe it was the obvious lie about working late. I knew her law firm had strict policies about overtime during non-trial periods, and they weren't in trial. Maybe it was remembering how she'd gasped. I've never felt this way before, during sex last weekend, using phrases I'd never heard from her in all our years together. Or maybe it was simply time for me to stop being the understanding husband who respected her privacy while she made a fool of me. I got dressed quietly, grabbed my keys, and headed to her office building downtown. The parking garage was nearly empty at this hour, but I recognized her red Tesla parked in her usual spot. I wasn't surprised when I saw it was empty. Sarah wasn't stupid enough to actually hook up in her office. She was too ambitious to risk her partnership track that way. But I knew where she would be. The Westin Hotel was just 2 blocks away, a favorite among the firm's out-of-town clients. More importantly, it was where Sarah had been insisting we book our date nights lately, claiming she wanted to spice things up. Now I wondered if she'd chosen it because she was already familiar with their rooms. The night clerk barely glanced up as I entered the lobby. I didn't need to ask for a room number. I'd installed a tracking app on Sarah's phone weeks ago, not out of jealousy initially, but out of a gnawing suspicion that she wasn't being honest about her whereabouts. The blue dot on my screen showed she was on the 8th floor. As I rode the elevator up, I thought about all the rules we'd established for our open marriage.
No emotional attachments.
No mutual friends or coworkers. Always use protection. Full disclosure about all partners. Looking back, I should have realized that someone pushing so hard for specific rules was probably already breaking them. The elevator doors opened, and I heard them before I saw them laughing and talking in the hallway. I recognized Sarah's voice instantly. The male voice took me a moment longer, but when it clicked, my blood ran cold. It was Jason Mitchell, my best friend since college, the best man at our wedding, and Sarah's coworker for the past 5 years. Time seemed to slow as I watched them fumble with the key card, both slightly drunk and completely oblivious to my presence at the end of the hallway. Sarah was wearing the black dress I'd bought her for our anniversary last month. Her hair was down the way Jason had once casually mentioned he liked it. Every detail felt like another knife in my chest. I stood there, frozen, as 15 years of memories crashed through my mind. Jason had been there for everything: our engagement party, the housewarming, countless holiday dinners. He'd helped me plan Sarah's 30th birthday surprise party just 6 months ago, all while sleeping with my wife. The rage that filled me wasn't hot. It was ice cold and clarifying. "You know," I said loudly, my voice eerily calm, "when you suggested opening our marriage, Sarah, I really should have asked if you were already fucking my best friend." They jumped apart like guilty teenagers. Sarah's face went ghost white, while Jason looked like he might throw up. "Good. Mike," Sarah gasped, taking a stumbling step toward me. "Baby, this isn't—" "Let me explain." "Explain what?" I cut her off. "How long you've been lying to me. How many times you've used our date night hotel for your affairs. Or maybe you'd like to explain how you convinced me to agree to an open marriage, just so you could feel less guilty about already cheating." Jason tried to step forward, hands raised in a placating gesture. "Listen, man, we never meant for this to happen. It just—" I moved so fast I surprised even myself. One moment I was standing there, The next my fist connected with Jason's jaw with a satisfying crack. He stumbled backward into the wall, blood trickling from his split lip. "Mike, stop!" Sarah screamed, grabbing my arm. "You're making a scene." I shook her off, my laugh hollow. "A scene? You're worried about a scene? That's rich coming from the woman who's been performing in this hotel, so often they probably know your favorite room service order." Security arrived then, drawn by the commotion. Sarah was crying, those same tears she'd used to manipulate me before. Jason was still pressed against the wall, looking everywhere but at me. I didn't resist as the security guard asked me to leave. But before I walked away, I turned back to them. "By the way, Sarah, I filed for divorce this afternoon. Check your email, your lawyer should have the papers by now. I've been gathering evidence for weeks. Those hotel receipts on the joint credit card, the texts I recovered, the video footage from our home security system showing Jason coming over while I was at work, it's all there." Sarah's perfectly mascaraed eyes widened in horror. You've been spying on me?" "No, honey," I replied, watching her flinch at the pet name. "I've been protecting myself. You see, I learned something interesting from your colleague Linda at the firm's Christmas party. Apparently, sleeping with coworkers is grounds for immediate termination, especially when one party is on the partnership track. I wonder how the ethics board will feel about that." Jason's face went from red to pale so fast I thought he might pass out. Sarah started to say something, but I held up my hand. "Don't bother. I'm sure you can craft some creative legal defense. You always were good at twisting the truth. But here's what's going to happen. You're going to agree to my divorce terms, which are more than fair considering the circumstances. You're going to tell your family and friends that you cheated, and you're going to admit that you manipulated me into an open marriage to cover your tracks. If you don't, well, I'm sure the managing partners at Morrison and Beck would love to know what their rising star has been up to." The next few days passed in a blur of calculated moves and countermoves. Sarah tried everything: desperate phone calls, tearful visits to our house, even sending her sister Emma to talk sense into me. I blocked her number and installed new locks. When Emma showed up, I simply played her the security footage of Sarah and Jason's afternoon visits. She left without saying a word, her face a mask of disgust. I later heard she'd canceled Sarah's invitation to her upcoming wedding. What surprised me most was how quickly Sarah's carefully constructed image crumbled once the truth came out. She'd always been the golden child of her family, the successful lawyer who had it all, loving husband, beautiful home, thriving career. Now, watching her scramble to control the narrative was like seeing a master puppeteer whose strings had suddenly been cut. I hadn't planned to tell our friends, but Sarah made that decision for me when she tried to spin the story her way. According to her version, I had been controlling and emotionally unavailable, pushing her into Jason's arms. She claimed the open marriage suggestion had been a desperate attempt to save our relationship. I simply responded by sharing our text conversations from the past few months in our friend group chat, the ones where she'd insisted everything was perfect between us, while simultaneously arranging her hotel meetings with Jason. The aftermath at her law firm was particularly satisfying. I hadn't actually intended to report their affair to the partners. That had been a calculated bluff. But Jason, proving himself just as spineless in crisis as he had been in friendship, panicked. He went to HR himself, probably hoping to get ahead of the story. By the end of the week, Sarah was placed on administrative leave pending an ethics investigation, and Jason had been transferred to the firm's Seattle office. Sarah's response was to show up at my office, mascara streaking down her face as she begged me to call off the divorce. "I'll do anything," she sobbed, causing a scene in front of my colleagues. "It was a mistake. Jason meant nothing to me. We can work through this." I looked at her, really looked at her, and wondered how I'd missed the signs for so long. The constant need for validation. The way she'd always played the victim when caught in lies. The subtle manipulation techniques that I'd mistaken for emotional vulnerability. "You know what's interesting, Sarah?" I said, keeping my voice level. "You're not sorry you cheated. You're sorry you got caught. You're not crying because you hurt me. You're crying because your perfect life is falling apart. The affair, the lies, the manipulation. That's who you really are. The devoted wife was just another role you played." "That's not true," she protested, reaching for my hand. I love you. I've always loved you. Jason was just... He was convenient. I finished for her. A willing participant in your game. Tell me something. Did you suggest the open marriage before or after he got engaged to Rebecca? The flash of guilt across her face told me everything I needed to know. Jason's fiancée Rebecca was another casualty in their web of lies, though she'd been spared the public humiliation I'd endured. She quietly called off the engagement and moved back to Chicago the day after our hotel confrontation. I thought so, I continued, gently removing my hand from her grasp. You didn't want an open marriage, Sarah. You wanted permission to keep sleeping with a man who was about to become unavailable. The fact that he was my best friend probably made it even more exciting. A little extra thrill of forbidden fruit to spice up your affair. Security arrived then. I texted them the moment I saw her enter the building. As they escorted her out, she turned back one last time, her face a perfect mask of anguished regret. You'll regret this, Mike. No one will ever love you like I do. I watched her leave, feeling nothing but a deep, tired pity. That's exactly what I'm counting on, I murmured to myself. A month after the hotel confrontation, I sat in my lawyer's office reviewing the final divorce settlement. Sarah had finally stopped fighting and agreed to my terms, but not because of any moral awakening. Her carefully constructed world had simply imploded too completely for her to maintain the battle. The ethics investigation at her firm had uncovered more than just her affair with Jason. 3 other junior associates came forward with stories of inappropriate relationships and workplace manipulation. Sarah had apparently made quite a habit of using sex as a tool for advancement, all while maintaining her image as the devoted wife who'd married her high school sweetheart. You better believe I report to the ethics board about you too, she'd hissed during our last mediation session, her mask of contrition finally cracking. If I'm going down, I'll take you with me. I'd simply smiled and slid a folder across the table. Inside were printed copies of every email, text, and document I'd gathered over the past months. Go ahead, I'd replied. Explain to them how you used our marriage counseling sessions to craft a better cover story. Tell them how you convinced me to agree to an open marriage just weeks before Jason's engagement, knowing it would give you plausible deniability. I'm sure they'll be fascinated by your level of premeditation. The look of defeat in her eyes had been worth every sleepless night I'd spent building my case. But my real revenge wasn't the divorce settlement or the professional consequences. It was the systematic dismantling of the narrative she'd spent years crafting. Every carefully cultivated relationship, every strategic connection she'd built, I made sure they all learned the truth, not through angry accusations, but through irrefutable evidence. I sent her parents the credit card statements showing hotel charges that coincided with nights she'd claimed to be working late. I showed her mentor at the firm the texts where she'd bragged about manipulating him into giving her better cases. I made sure her social circle saw the dating app profiles she'd created months before suggesting we open our marriage. The truly devastating part? I never had to say a word against her. Her own actions, laid bare without emotion or commentary, did all the damage necessary. People who'd known us for years started reaching out, sharing stories of times they'd caught her in lies, but had dismissed their suspicions because Sarah would never, but she had, and she would have continued if I hadn't caught her. One evening, as I was leaving my office, I ran into Linda, the colleague who'd initially tipped me off about the firm's fraternization policies. She'd just finished testifying at Sarah's ethics hearing. You know what the scariest part is? Linda said, shaking her head. She actually seemed to believe her own lies. When they confronted her with evidence of all her affairs, she tried to argue that she was the victim of a system that forced women to use any means necessary to advance. As if sleeping with half the junior partnership track was some sort of feminist statement. I laughed, but it wasn't really funny. That's Sarah's superpower. She can justify anything if it serves her interests. I'm just glad I got out before she completely destroyed my ability to trust anyone. Linda touched my arm gently. Don't let her take that from you. Some people are just really good at hiding who they really are. It doesn't mean everyone is lying. I nodded, but we both knew it wasn't that simple. Trust, once shattered so completely, doesn't reassemble easily. But that was a problem for another day. Right now, I had one final piece of my revenge plan to set in motion, and this one would ensure that Sarah's carefully crafted image would never recover. The final piece of evidence arrived on a Tuesday morning. Ironically, the same day Sarah's ethics hearing was scheduled to conclude. I'd spent a considerable sum hiring a private investigator to dig into her past, not out of vindictiveness, but because something about her pattern of behavior had always nagged at me. People don't usually become master manipulators overnight, and Sarah's ability to compartmentalize her lies had seemed almost practiced. The manila envelope on my desk contained the answer to questions I hadn't even known to ask. Sarah Harrison, my wife of 8 years, had been Sarah Mitchell before she changed her name at 18. And before that, she'd been Sarah Winters. 3 names, 3 different cities, 3 completely different lives. The pattern was always the same. She'd integrate herself into a community, build relationships, manipulate situations to her advantage, and then vanish when things started to unravel. The most damning discovery wasn't even her multiple identities. It was the paper trail of her previous engagement 6 months before she'd met me. A relationship that had ended when her then-fiancé discovered she was simultaneously involved with his business partner and their company's biggest client. The similarity to my situation was chilling. I waited until the ethics hearing was in its final session before having the documents delivered. I made sure copies went to everyone. The ethics board, her lawyer, her parents, and most importantly, to the State Bar Association. Sarah had built her entire legal career on a foundation of carefully constructed lies, beginning with her bar application where she'd failed to disclose her previous identities and history. I wasn't in the room when she received the papers, but Linda described it to me later. Sarah had been in the middle of her final statement, weaving another masterful tale of misunderstood intentions and professional persecution. Then she'd opened the envelope. Linda said the change in her expression was like watching a mask physically crack. "I've never seen anything like it," Linda told me over coffee the next day. She just stopped, mid-sentence. Then she started laughing. Not normal laughter. It was almost hysterical. When the board chairman asked if she needed a moment, she looked him straight in the eye and said, "You know what's funny? I actually convinced myself this time would be different. I really thought I'd finally perfected the story." Sarah's professional career ended that day, along with her carefully constructed identity. The State Bar began disbarment proceedings immediately. Her family, already strained by the affair revelations, cut ties completely when they learned their beloved daughter had been living under an assumed name for over a decade. Even her most ardent supporters couldn't rationalize away this level of deception. The last time I saw Sarah was through the window of my favorite coffee shop, a week after the hearing. She was walking down the street, her designer clothes replaced by jeans and a simple sweater, her perfectly styled hair now natural and unstyled. She looked younger somehow, more like the girl I thought I'd married. But there was something different in her walk, a tension, as if she was already planning her next escape, her next reinvention. For a moment, our eyes met through the glass. There was no anger in her expression, no remorse, just a flicker of what might have been respect. She nodded once, a slight smile playing at her lips, then turned and walked away. I never saw her again. Later that evening, as I sat in my house, I found her wedding ring on the kitchen counter with a note. "You won. Congratulations on being the first one to beat me at my own game. I'd say I'm sorry, but we both know I'd be lying. Goodbye, Mike." I should have felt triumphant. My revenge was complete, more complete than I'd ever imagined possible. Instead, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief, sadness, and a strange sort of gratitude. Sarah's betrayal had taught me more about myself than 15 years of love ever had. But most importantly, it had taught me that sometimes the best revenge isn't about destroying someone else's life. It's simply about exposing the truth they've worked so hard to hide. Thank you for listening the story to the end. Write your thoughts about it in the comments and do not forget to subscribe. See you in the next videos. Bye.